I think we can start. If you can all please take your seats. My name's Theo Marcos. I'm a member of the Greek community, the board of the Greek community of Melbourne and Victoria, and I might as well declare my conflict of interest. I was a member of the Greek Progressive Youth back in the 80s, so I was in the last sort of era. I don't think you'll be speaking about them today, George. Is that right? 60s and 70s. Maybe there'll be a whole special lecture, even though we've got quorum, I think, of the last board of management of the Greek Progressive Youth of Australia here, but maybe for the next time around. Look, I begin, of course, by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet, and, of course, pay my respects to their elders, both past, present, and emerging. I'll only say a few words, and that is to thank very much the Trobe University's Greek Studies Department and the Dardalis archives of the Hellenic Diaspora for giving us the opportunity here at the Greek community to present what I believe were 6 extremely successful lectures on the history of us here, of Greek Australians. And I'm hoping that next year we will continue what I believe was a very successful working relationship. A big thank you to Steffi Nikoloudis, who heads the Greek Studies Language Program. If it wasn't for Steffi, this wouldn't become reality. Thank you very, very much, Steffi. I wish you all the best for the future. I'm sure that your program will continue next year, and I'm sure that we will continue our strong working relationship not only next year but in the years to come. It's very important that you continue to exist at La Trobe University and that you prosper. And I've said it before, and we as a community make a commitment that we'll always be behind you and we will always support the work that you're doing. I also thank Michael Protopapa. Thank you very much, Michael, for your excellent work. You've been here at every lecture. You've had a fantastic exhibition of what you've been doing there. And I urge everyone that hasn't been to go and visit the archives, which are at La Trobe University. I also thank Dimitri Gorni, who's the other lecturer that's part of the Steffi's team. He's not here tonight, but thank you, Dimitri, for all your contribution. And James Walker, thank you very much for supporting these guys, and we appreciate your support and the support of La Trobe University. And I think that's fantastic. And before I pass it on to Steffi, I'd like to say a big thank you to Juliana Karpandidou, Christos Fifis, Dr. Konstantina Dounas, Dimitris Gonis, and Peter Younidis. Peter, you're here for their fantastic 5 lectures that were presented throughout the year. And of course, I thank George Vasilakopoulos for presenting his lecture tonight. Without further ado, may I ask Steffi Nikoloudis from the Greek department to say a few words. Thank you, Steffi.
Thank you, Theo. Kalispera σας και καλώς ορίσατε. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming to the 6th and final talk of our series of lectures on the history of the Greeks in Australia in 6 objects. This research seminar series has been a collaboration between La Trobe's Greek Studies program, the Dardalis archives of the Hellenic Diaspora, curated by La Trobe University Library, and the Greek Orthodox community of Melbourne and Victoria, whom we thank once again for their collaboration and for the use of this beautiful mezzanine venue for these talks. Theo and Costa Markou, thank you, and Nick Dallas, thank you for agreeing to be a part of this project. Costa Avloniti, thank you for producing our handouts for each talk. The Dardalis archives, named after their main benefactor, Mr. Zissis Dardalis, are a unique collection of memorabilia ranging from very personal items such as letters, photos, clothing even, to more public items such as newspapers, cinema equipment, and over 15,000 books, all of which in their own way reflect the history of Greeks in Australia, Greek migration to Australia. And for this reason, the Dardalis archives are a resource of national historic significance. The goals of our seminar series, in which our presenters were asked to take as their starting point an object in the collection, have been to showcase the material in the archives and to engage with the wider community, to spark the interest of our students and scholars, and to generate new research based on the contents of the collection. And I'd just like to extend a special note of thanks to several individuals before we begin tonight. First of all, Professor James Walker, head of the Department of Languages and Linguistics at La Trobe University, where Greek studies belong. Thank you, James, for your excellent and steadfast support and guidance concerning the archives and Greek studies in general. And for being here, you've been at most of these talks, which is an excellent show of genuine support. The La Trobe Library University administrators, the Executive Director, Fiona Salisbury, the Deputy Director of Scholarly Collections, Simon Huggard, the Senior Manager of Collections and Access, Arlene O'Sullivan, and the team who has worked and cared for the archives. The team includes Eva Fish, Maria Martzalorso, Leonidas Veikos, and Michael Protopapas. An extra special thank you to Michael for working closely with me to make sure that everything was ready and lined up for each lecture. I'd also like to thank those members of the public who formed part of the Greek Archives Project Committee. And this was a committee that oversaw the very important initial listing of all the contents of the archives. It included Mr. Tassos Revis, Mr. George Pangalis. Mr. Pangalis is here tonight. Thank you for your support. And has been here at every lecture, along with his wife Angela, so thank you so much. Mr. Spiros Rombotis, Mr. George Papadopoulos, and others. In particular, I need to mention that we really owe an amazing debt of gratitude to Mr. Tassos Revis. Without his persistence, I don't know if the archives would have survived. So it's thanks to his commitment and to the library's interest that the archives are acquiring the visibility and the consideration that they deserve. After all, they do hold precious information about Australia's history. Thank you also to the members of the media for promoting this lecture series, in particular Sotiris Hadjimanolis and his team at Neos Kosmos, Elias Diakolabrianos and his team at 3ZZZ, Panos Apostolou at SBS, and Irena Fragoudaki at 3XY. I thank our presenters, of course, for their involvement. Without you, there wouldn't have been a lecture series, as I've said before, so I thank you so much for being so open and willing to be a part of this project. It's been an absolute joy and pleasure to work with you, and I hope that we can continue this collective collaboration into the future. Our students for their support, and of course, everyone for turning up to these Wednesday night talks and for making them a success. And since this is the final talk of the series, I thought it would be worthwhile just to briefly remind ourselves of the different kinds of objects that we have had a chance to look at since May. So we started off with Juliana Harpadidou's talk, where she was able to make use of copies of correspondence held in the archives of religious authorities in Jerusalem and members of the very first Greek Orthodox community of Melbourne and Victoria. So letters in that first talk. Then Dr. Chris Fifis and Dr. Kostadina Dounis were able to use some photos from the archives to use in their talks. Next was Dimitris Gonis. Dr. Dimitris Gonis consulted a beautiful book produced by La Trobe on the artist Vlasis Zanalis, held by the archives. We then had last month Mr. Peter Yanoudis talking to us about Greek cinema in Australia. The archives has a whole room dedicated to Greek cinema in Australia. Posters, cinematic equipment, film reels. So quite a few different objects there. Letters, photos, books, films. And this brings us to tonight's talk, which takes as its starting point yet another type of object, this time a pamphlet. And I'll let our speakers talk to you about that. The talk is by Dr. Toula Nikolakopoulos and Dr. George Vasilakopoulos, who are members of the Department of Politics, Media and Philosophy at La Trobe University. They teach modern European and Greek philosophy. They've published on a number of philosophers such as Hegel, Plato, Heidegger, Castoriadis. They've worked on political theory, critical race and whiteness theory, and the history of Greek Australian political activism. Tonight, the talk that Dr. George Vasilakopoulos will be presenting to us is about post-60s Greek Australian youth activism. Let's please make him feel welcome.
Hello, everyone. Let me begin by saying that under the leadership of my wonderful colleague, Dr. Stephanie Koloudis, amazing things are happening in the Greek program at La Trobe today. And I just want to urge the community, the Greek community at large, and more specifically, the Greek Orthodox community of Melbourne and Victoria, to find ways to support the program morally, politically, and financially. Okay. Thanks everyone for coming. So many friends in the audience. It almost feels like a reunion. Okay. A number of colleagues were invited to visit the Dardalis Hellenic Archive Research Center and find an object and using it for a seminar. When Tula and I entered the space, and by the way, apologies from Tula, it was impossible for her to be with us tonight for a number of reasons. When we entered the exhibition space, the first thing we saw was this, not there, but a version of this. And so it happened that both of us were members of the group that published it. Okay? So we thought we'll say something about it. Okay? So we came up with the title, Greek-Australian Youth Activism Post-60s. It's a misleading title, slightly, because I'll speak more about the 60s and then move backwards, and I'll explain why. This is part of an ongoing research project, which is based on many interviews. We've conducted more than 50 interviews, Greek-Australian political activists, trade union officials in Melbourne, Sydney, Newcastle. And we've been studying archival material for a number of different organizations, government documents, newspapers. And we have been documenting the history of Greek-Australian political activism throughout the 20th century. Okay? And at the same time, we have developed an interpretive model, a way of reading those developments in the community, those political interventions of migrants, and more specifically of Greek migrants. So tonight, I will try to combine historical material with, if you like, an interpretive approach. Okay? So a historical material and then a kind of thinking about it and trying to create a kind of story about this political presence of migrants. Although this is an academic exercise, both Tula and myself are members of the community, of the Greek-Australian community, and we have participated in a number of different organizations for many years. So this exercise for us is also, if you like, a journey of self-discovery, a journey of making sense of ourselves. Who are we as migrants or as children of migrants? My family migrated here in 1974. I had almost finished high school. Tula was born here. So in this project, we bring two different perspectives, if you like. And combining them, we try to question, ask questions, and hopefully provide answers. Because of this, because of our involvement with the community, I want to frame what I'll be presenting today with these two quotes. Τίνος πατρίδα είναι, ποιοι είμαστε, ποια είναι η κατεύθυνσή μας, whose country is this, who are we, which is our direction. These are questions that are asked in a recent publication by my very, very dear friend and colleague, Chris Fititis. Chris is a very committed member of the community for a very long time, and at the beginning of the 21st century, through his wonderful work about the history of the community, he asks those truly fundamental questions. He asks them from a migrant perspective, But the truth of the matter is that those questions cover the entire historical field of what we call modern Australia. Whose country is this? And who are we? I'll be proposing later on that in order for us migrants to answer the question, who are we truly need to engage with the first question, whose country is this? But in order to engage, to truly engage with history, we have to take into account that the real challenge is to find our own measure. As Antigone Kefala, our great poet Antigone Kefala, proposes, we need to find our own measure, not the echo of other voices. And very often, in the multicultural spectrum of Australia, ethnic communities lose their own voice, and they speak with the voice of others, as I will try to explain. So this is the main claim of our presentation. The link between the organizational development of the Greek Australian communities and wider white Australian society is such that a study of the former's positioning as an inside-outsider of the latter provides us with a vantage point from which Australian society might look deeper into its own self rather than merely beyond itself to its other. Now, a couple of points. In our project, we are interested not in the phenomenology of the migrant experience of individual migrants. We are interested in how the community gathers itself, comes together, and creates public spaces through organizations like this one in order to, if you like, enact an identity for itself, in order to present itself as a community of migrants into Australia. So this is, if you like, the focus of our project, the public spaces created by the community. And those public spaces, as I'll try to explain, are the spaces of those who dwell inside our society, the society we call Australia, but at the same time outside. As insiders, outsiders, we are the bearers of a historical perspective of huge significance, as I'll try to explain. But this significance is not what we usually think. We are significant, but perhaps for the wrong reasons. So the challenge of the project is to try to read modern Australian history through a particular perspective, the perspective of this particular migrant or ethnic community. Okay? So guys, I will begin by presenting the broader interpretive frame very briefly. Then I'll move on and present historical material. And then, in the last part, revisit how we think Australian history and trying to say something more substantial about it. Now, this comes from Tony Birch, who is a well-known Indigenous Australian. Non-Indigenous Australia needs to reassess its place within an Indigenous nation, including a willingness to accede to the principle of Indigenous sovereignty. Okay? So this comes, it's a very typical, if you like, statement from Indigenous Australians. Let's go back to Chris Fititis. Whose country is this? Who are we? Which is our direction? In our project, we make an attempt in understanding the history of the Greek Australian communities in the 20th and 21st centuries as an integral aspect of the history of white Australia, colonialism, and the creation of a settler colonial national identity. So in our project, although the immediate object is the experience of the Greek communities, there is here a broader question, the question of national identity. If we try to look at ourselves from this bigger perspective, then we have to think of ourselves as an integral aspect of this project. Okay? So the challenge here is to be able to read the history of the communities, not as something more or less isolated and self-perpetuating unit within the broader context of modern Australia, but to read our history as truly an integral aspect of the wider history of modern Australia. And our proposal is that, as I mentioned before, that in order for us to achieve this, we have to take very, very seriously the challenge posed to us by those who claim, in my opinion, in a very genuine manner, this country as the country, which is Indigenous Australia. Now, this is the interpretive framework. Very briefly, I'll come back to it, but just to have this frame in your mind. Creation of white Australian national identity since federation, and the role of the communities of the perpetual foreigner within. We propose that this development of national identity goes through two stages since 1901. In this first stage, Australia develops itself as a united, if you like, nation, state, through a double process of displacing or excluding. On the one hand, it totally excludes Indigenous Australians, totally. It makes them invisible. This is an act of crime. It is the act of colonialism. Okay? Take into consideration that from this perspective, the history of modern Australia begins in 1492. Why? In 1492, Columbus discovers the Americans. And Europeans begin creating, not all Europeans, certain European countries, begin creating their identity, the modern European identity, by elevating themselves to the managers of humanity. Okay? And they do this through colonialism, through occupation. Australia is one of the last chapters of this hugely complex and violent story that lasted for centuries. Okay? So here, what we have with the creation of modern Australia is a typical colonial move. You make the other, the true owner of a particular land, invisible. On the other hand, Australia, modern white Australia, Australia from the British tradition, in displacing, in willing, if you like, the being of the Indigenous Australians out of being, at the same time, it wills the being of ethnic communities into being and also wills the being out of being. In other words, in the center circle, we have the Australian version of the manager of humanity, who basically, through an act of will, says, these are not humans, and these are in between. The Greek communities in the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, up to the 1960s, before multiculturalism, are insiders, outsiders. They are white, but not white enough. I'll come back to this kind of terminology. Okay. If you read the government documents and newspapers of the era, you'll be surprised. Now, this is stage one, before 1973. In stage two, things become slightly more complicated. As you can see, from 1970 to 1973 to the present, we have another kind of historical move. Ethnic communities like the Greeks and the Italians are drawn into the main spaces of the Australian nation. Okay? And the place of the insider-outsider, the place of the white but not white enough, is now occupied by someone else, the Muslim Australian communities. The net result is the same. The nation creates an identity by displacing the true owners of the land. Those who resist and those who present themselves as sovereign, as self-determining. Those who ask for the country to be given to them back. What is truly the significance of this kind of complex interrelating between those groups? Modern Western Australia, our claim is, creates its national identity, okay, by managing the foreigner. Okay? So ethnic communities like the Greeks in the 40s, 50s, 60s, or ethnic communities like the Muslims today are managed as the communities of the foreigner, and therefore those who manage them are the locals. It is through this kind of, if you like, positioning of itself into the place of the manager, White Australia creates an identity by exercising the fundamental issue of the demand of sovereignty of indigenous Australians, which makes it impossible for us whites to truly claim this land as ours, to truly claim it as patrida. If we take this historical movement into consideration, this is present-day Australia. At the very top, we have the Anglo-Celts, and I'll try to say something about this particular group. And at the bottom, we have the Arab Muslims, and of course, the indigenous Australians. And in the middle, acting as a buffer zone, we have the successful communities of the Greeks and the Italians. What is truly amazing is that if you look at Australia in those racial terms, what you have is a micro picture of the racial division of the world today. The world today is divided like this. You have the countries of colonialism, the big countries, European countries mainly. By European, I don't mean countries in the European, geographically, the European project, the US, Canada, France, Germany, of course, Australia, New Zealand. You have those countries. You have buffer zones like Greece. Greece, modern Greece was created, we can talk about it and debate it, as a buffer zone. And we have those who fell out of the picture. They're not fully human yet, basically. Okay? So modern Australia is a reproduction of a world order. And the Greek communities today, our argument is, just fall in the middle. It is the buffer zone. Okay? Not white enough, but at the same time white. Now, this is, if you like, the broader picture. I'll come back to it, okay, if we have time, if you don't get bored. But now, let's begin with the history. This truly significant event happens in 1980, okay, in 1980. In 1980, the arts faculty of the University of Monash decides to get rid of the modern Greek program. Okay? Students from Greek Australian background get very upset. To be honest, I don't remember the reason, but anyway, we got upset. Most of those who participated in the campaign were studying Greek. Some of us, like myself, didn't study Greek. But Greek Australian students from Monash, Melbourne, and La Trobe were campaigning against the decision for a whole year. It was an extremely intense campaign. Thousands of leaflets were distributed in Greek and English. And if you like, the culmination of this campaign was we went to the city square and we just sat there. It was 1980, the Fraser years. We called it hunger strike. We felt, to put it mildly, alive, as you can see from the picture. Not very alive, this is 2 o'clock in the morning. Okay, not very alive. But anyway, we stayed there. We had the privilege of Ezio coming and taking pictures, basically. A couple of us went across the road where there was a McDonald's and I ate a couple. Maria, am I correct? Souvlaki, that's right. So, anyway, it was truly a magnificent campaign. Just try to think, it was, if you like, the first of its kind. Okay? Try to imagine just a group of 50, 60, 100 Greek Australian students in the public spaces of white Australia, in a country with big traditions of racism that had, if you like, discovered tolerance, demonstrating, and this is where I want to draw your attention, demonstrating on this magic word, right. You see? Give us the right to our language. The Dean of Arts at Monash, he replied that we have given you the privilege of your language. It's not a right. So here we have a fundamental difference of approaches, if you like. Okay? The campaign was so intense that the Union of Australian Students were very impressed. They supported us. And two of our members, Tula and Alekos, got elected in the union, which was a big achievement. Okay? So just concentrate on the term right, because tonight I'll be exploring how this term appears and how it is appropriated by migrant groups. Okay? If we look at the historical landscape of the Greek community, especially the Greek community of Melbourne and Victoria, we can identify 4 moments of youth political activism. The first is the Olympic Youth Club, late 1940s, early 1950s. The Olympic Youth Club was not politically active in the usual kind of sense, but from within the Greek community, it was one of the first voices that criticized the leaders of the community. Okay? They criticized the leaders of the community for the way they approached youth problems. Okay? From this perspective, they opened up a space within the community for critical engagement with the leaders of the community, especially the leaders of this organization, who were prominent Greeks, most of them business people. I'll come back to it later. So that was the first moment. But the second, which was a truly political moment, appears in the 1960s with the formation of the Labrakis Democratic Youth of Australia. The Labrakis Democratic Youth of Australia lasted until 1975. So it's before 1973, before the Whitlam years, and after. Okay? We have the privilege of, some members of the Labrakis Youth, Thanasi, are here with us tonight. It's a great privilege, and thank you. Then we move to the fourth moment, which is the creation of the Greek Progressive Youth of Australia, which was a continuation of the Labrakis Democratic Youth movement. It was established in 1976-77, and it lasted until the end of the 1980s, 1990, for about 12, 14 years. And of course, within this period, we have the mobilization for the protection, so to speak, of the modern Greek studies. Okay, guys? So this is, if you like, the spectrum here. Now, by the way, this is some material from EPNA, of the festivals of the Greek Progressive Youth. They used to produce beautiful posters, and most of those posters were made by my very, very dear friend, Agi Angelopoulos, and it's an honor, Agi, to be here with us tonight. Thanks for coming. Now, in my talk today, I'll be mainly concentrating on the Labrakis youth, because it is there that young Greek Australians formulate, if you like, quite intensely and deeply the discourse of rights, okay, through a great campaign against conscription with the Vietnam War. So here we have a number of questions. There is a dominant idea. Migrants become politically active after the state adopts the policy of multiculturalism. This is factually inaccurate. As I'll try to explain, the migrant discourse of rights begins in the early 1950s, or perhaps the late 1940s. Okay? Then people make a rather artificial distinction between political activities within the Greek community and outside it. As we'll see, the Labrakis Greek youth brought everything together, basically. It opened up political spaces that would operate as bridges between the community and the rest of Australian society. And, this is significant, in the 1950s, Greek migrants arrive in established, complexly structured, politically organized communities advocating for migrant rights. As we'll see, advocating for migrant rights also meant defining the meaning of citizenship. Who is the citizen of this country? And migrants provided answers. So the Labrakis democratic youth activities were shaped by 4 political dimensions: events in Greece, events in Australia, an international perspective, and events in the Greek community. Okay? For our younger friends here, I'll say very briefly a couple of things about Greece. Greece was occupied by the Germans. Then we have the glorious Greek resistance, truly glorious. And the largest part of this resistance was inspired by socialist ideas. They wanted, after the occupation, to reorganize Greece in socialist ideas. That was fatal, because after the Germans left Greece, the English and the Americans intervened basically, and we had the Civil War, which was absolutely brutal. It lasted for 3 years, thousands lost their lives, and after the Civil War, thousands upon thousands also lost their lives, or spent a lifetime, 20, 30 years in prisons, members of the left, basically. Okay? And also, we have the hugely traumatic event of mass migration. Okay, guys? So, occupation, resistance, civil war, the exile, the islands of exile, and migration. Okay? In the 1950s, the left finds its voice. It creates the United Democratic Left, and this political party becomes quite influential. So there is again a friction between right and left, and the right-wingers start assassinating people. The most famous assassination is the assassination of Labrakis. Okay, Labrakis was a doctor, a very well-respected doctor, a very well-known athlete, and a member of the left in the parliament. When he was assassinated in 1963, the Labrakis Youth is created. And it became a big kind of movement in Greece, and it inspired youth in Australia, and they created, after a year, the Labrakis Democratic Youth, basically. Okay. Now, when Labrakis was assassinated, this became the famous slogan, Z, he lives, and the Democratic Labrakis Youth all over the world had the Z as the symbol. Okay? Most of you know those kinds of things. After that, of course, we have the Greek junta from 1967 to 1974. Okay? Take into account that Greeks in Australia, since the creation of this community, live and experience events in Greece very intensely. Okay? Very intensely. Okay? But I interpret them differently, as we'll see very shortly. At the same time, in the 1960s, or if you like, in the long 1960s, in Australia, we have also very significant events. We have the movement for Aboriginal rights. We have big migrant strikes, 1962 in Holden, 1973 in Ford. Greeks and Turks play a major role in those strikes. We have the anti-Vietnam War. We have the Beatles, of course. We have the rise of the Labour Party, slowly. Mass migration continues. And we have a very strong public presence of migrant political activists. Okay? And very often, the Greeks at the forefront. Okay? And those campaigns took a number of forms. Campaigns for equal rights. Campaigns for citizenship. If you were politically active, the Australian state would not make you a citizen. Okay? So you had migrants being in Australia for years and years, 30, 40 years, without being able to become citizens. Okay? Those things changed when the Labour Party, and before that, was elected. We have trade union campaigns, discrimination in the workplace. We have the anti-Vietnam War, and we have protests against the Greek junta, and protests for Cyprus, independence of Cyprus. Okay? So what you can see here is the developing of the discourse of migrant rights and a strong presence of migrants in the public spaces of this country. So migrants start, if you like, claiming those public spaces, okay? Making themselves felt in those public spaces. Okay? The other dimension, of course, is within the Greek community. Within the Greek community, since the 1940s, there is a conflict of how to make sense of themselves as migrants. And in a sense, it is a conflict of how to interpret our symbols, if you like. national symbols. And here we have two different interpretations. Okay? Some Greeks believed that the main thing is to be Greek in Australia, and some other Greeks believed that the main challenge is to become Greek Australian. Those two attitudes divided the community between the left and the right, basically. Okay? So as you can see up there, the national costume in the public Australian spaces, in May Day marches or in favor of the trade unions or campaigns for workers' rights. At the bottom, something that continues today, it's the presence of Greeks in Australia, more or less. Okay? I'll come back to that because it's quite significant. So just remember, becoming Greek Australian or being Greek in Australia. This comes from Lukas Stavrias, who was the secretary of the Labrakis Democratic Youth in 1965. The Beatles, we asked him, did the members of the organization went to the Beatles? And he said, the Beatles, who had time for the Beatles when we could listen to Theodorakis? Okay? Theodorakis, the famous Greek composer, was a member of the left, and his music, his political music, has been identified with the modern struggles of Greeks for liberation, basically. Okay? So the Labrakis youth was very much inspired, even culturally, from events in Greece. So, the more historical stuff now. The Labrakis Democratic Youth marked the beginning of the Greek-Australian progressive youth movement that lasted for 25 years, if we take into account the Greek Progressive Youth of Australia. The organization was active for 10 years and was succeeded by the Greek Progressive Youth of Australia. In 1965, the Melbourne-based organization consisted of 95 members, 55 male and 40 female, aged between 16 and 28. 15 were university students and the rest workers or unemployed. In the following years, the numbers increased dramatically. This was the first occasion in the history of the Greek communities on which women not only constituted a significant proportion of the membership, but they took an equal part in promoting the club's goals. LDY maintained close ties with their counterpart in Greece, actively demonstrating the solidarity where necessary. But, and this is a significant aspect for us, but they were independent associations seeking to define and develop their identity as Greek Australian. Okay, guys? So, how did I do that? Becoming Greek Australian. This comes from Neos Kosmos. Take into account that Neos Kosmos was created by the Greek Australian left and was very closely aligned with the Labrakis Democratic Youth. This is Neos Kosmos. Such an organization would, of course, share the same ideals with the youth of Greece, but it would also view itself as an integral part of Australian society. In other words, a Greek-Australian organization had to be formed, and this is precisely what eventuated. With the functions, dances, social gatherings, etc., the participation in demonstrations for peace and against the Vietnam War, the support for the restoration of democracy in Greece and independence for Cyprus, the willingness to struggle for the major issues of concern to the Australian people show that the newly formed organizations will play an important role in the shaping of the Greek community. At stake here is the reshaping of the Australian community by opening up political spaces and the reshaping of the Greek community itself. This created, as we'll see, a lot of tension, basically. Now, they were the main issues of political concerns of the organization. Migrant rights, of course, rights of indigenous Australians, armament spending, the Vietnam War and world peace, low wage rates, lack of education and leisure activities within the Greek communities, the Cyprus question, migrant youth, language education, housing, childcare services, democracy in Greece. Okay? So all of them, all those issues were part of the political agenda of this particular organization. Activities and campaigns, lectures, music, poetry evenings, film screenings, picnics, dances, dance groups, choirs, volleyball and basketball teams, free English language classes, and peace anti-conscription mobilizations. Labraki's youth clubs were created all over Australia, especially in the main cities, Melbourne, Adelaide, and Sydney, and they started cooperating, and they would meet every 3 years approximately, and have their congresses and discussing the political situation in Australia within the Greek communities in Greece and internationally. They would organize pre-Congress discussions, and they held 2 congresses in Sydney in 1966 and 68. Congresses were addressed by peace and anti-conscription movements, the Council of Churches, the trade union movement, and ethnic groups. In other words, the youth itself became a meeting place of the broader community. And they started creating alliances between migrants and representatives of more broader organizations. But this is the big thing that, if you like, marked the political character of the organization, as we'll see. The Vietnam War and conscription. By March 1966, the new Prime Minister Holt was publicly advocating his endorsement of the conscription of non-naturalized migrants on the ground that those who come to live with us permanently should do military services just like our own young people. According to Neos Kosmos, 15,000 Greek migrants fell into this category. Okay? So ultimately, the government wanted to decide to send to the Vietnam War newly arrived migrants. You know, just simple as that. Okay? Now, this comes from Neos Kosmos, and the language itself is very, very expressive, and it shows the political turn in migrant activism. We become migrants because we believe that we could lead a better life here. We came to work to make a home and family. We are not at all ashamed to reveal our reasons for coming here, but we don't owe anyone any gratitude. No, we are not prepared to say thank you to Menzies and Holt for their kindness. Whatever we have achieved has been the result of our own sweat. No one gave us a cent without us having worked for double that amount. If we owe anything to anyone, it's to the proud Australian people, to the labour movement that has embraced us as equals. Migrants are not opportunists, nor are they adventurers. We have never denied our responsibilities. We pay our taxes and contribute to the country's development. If necessary, we will even take up arms to defend the country we have made our home. We will not stand on technicalities on the face of foreign invasion. We will not say, but we are not naturalized. Nor will Mr. Holt be obliged to call us up for military service. We'll join up as volunteers, just as migrants did during the Great War against fascism when the Japanese militarists attacked us. Migrants slowly try to formulate their own conception of citizenship. And they start, if you like, lecturing mainstream society about the true meaning of citizenship, which interestingly place it beyond, as they say, the technicalities of being a naturalized Australian. You see, that's beyond it. Okay? But citizenship for them means defending your country, not fighting others' wars. Now, this comes from a pre-Congress declaration of the youth club. Our migrant youth will not shed its blood to serve foreign interests. We are willing and obliged to protect Australia's territorial integrity, but no one is posing any threat to Australia. It is in respect to this issue, conscription, that we ought to judge the patriotism of every organization and our national and religious leaders. So these guys, middle 1960s, Australia, they turned the table and they asked the authorities to prove their patriotism. Okay? So we have here the parameters of a debate that changes as, you know, those of you who know the history or participated, Labour Party capitalized in all those kind of attitudes, okay, to its great political benefit. And yeah. This is now a very interesting quote. We, the Labrakis youth of Australia, Being true to centuries-long history of Greek liberation struggles. Now, this is very interesting and very important. They make a direct connection between themselves and the ancient Greece, the ancient Greeks, okay? This is a hotly debated issue. I'll try to explain it later on, okay? Are proudly looking forward to our second Congress. Greece is the land of freedom. It gave birth to democracy out of the shining light of its ancient civilization, a light that shines upon all struggling peoples everywhere. The glorious history of Greece consists of nothing other than the endless struggles and sacrifices of its people in the name of liberation, whether from internal or external enemies. What does it mean to be Greek? To connect yourself with those long century struggles of liberation. Where do those struggles begin? In ancient Greece, with the ideals of freedom and democracy. What, of course, is bypassed here is Christianity itself. From this perspective, Christianity, Orthodox Christianity, of course, that developed mainly in Byzantium, is the institution that very closely collaborates with those who have power, authorities. The emperor, for example, or the Greek state, or as we'll see later on, the Australian state itself. This reveals already an aspect of the debate about Greek identity that has been going on since the creation of the modern Greek state in 1832. Who is Greek? What is our connection with our glorious past? Which is, of course, hybrid, the past of ancient Greece and the Christian past of Byzantium. Okay? And what do the Europeans think? I'll try to propose later on, if we have time, I can see that people are getting tired, that modern Greece, to a great extent, is a European construction, not a Greek construction. I'll come back to it. Okay? So the campaign against conscription was a very intense one. They would circulate an anti-conscription petition amongst Greek migrants. They would form an alliance with other ethnic communities, join the wide-eyed Vietnam War movement, send letters to Greece advising would-be immigrants to the possible fate, keep the Greek-Australian community informed of the situation, demand that the Greek Orthodox communities, like this one here, the local press and the church oppose conscription. Broad-based support for the protest actions. The mobilization took activists to cinemas, football fields, the cafes, factories, people's homes and business. When the many thousands of signatures had been gathered, large public meetings were held to form delegations to Parliament. Dr. Kearns, Dr. Colloquot, Dr. Childs, Mr. Sutherland, and many, many others would participate. Members would get arrested in anti-Vietnam War demonstrations. Okay? They would also organize marathon marches, marches of peace. And in Melbourne, they would run, or perhaps walk, Thanasi, you know better, from Frankston to Melbourne. I don't know how many made it, but you know that was part of the famous marathon march of the Greek migrants. This is the last quote. With this action, migrants' conscription, the government has shown how far it is prepared to go to appease public concern about the senseless loss of Australian lives in Vietnam. The government must have thought that it could make an impact. We lost it. Whose fault is this, Nick? Now, this is interesting because it introduces a key term. The government must have thought that it could make an impact by saying to Australians, what are you complaining about? We are sending off foreigners to be killed alongside you. We openly protest against mere campaign that the government and its agencies have directed against migrants, representing them as cowardly, worthless traitors to the Australian nation, worthy of Australians' contempt. They criticize migrants for not showing interest in the future of the nation, or not contributing, of course, to the creation of national identity. The key term here is the foreigner. Okay? The key term in the development of Australian identity is the foreigner, basically. Okay? And it is this term that divided the Greek community itself. Because as I'll suggest in a minute, Greeks themselves accepted, for a number of very serious reasons, the status of the foreigner. And then the Greek community, especially in the 1940s, was divided between those who would say, we are citizens, we have rights, and those who would say, no, we are hosts, and we have to be thankful. We are guests, sorry, and we have to be thankful to the host. Okay? So, migrant rights, from foreigner to citizen. When do migrants stop presenting themselves as foreigners and begin demanding recognition as citizens, and under what conditions? We lost it? No. What does the campaign for migrant rights begin? What is the relation between ethnicity and citizenship? What is the meaning of the historical relation that is framed by the violence of colonialism, the relation between Anglo-Celtic Australians, ethnic communities, and Indigenous Australians? Now, take into account, friends, that the question of the historical relation of this ontological encounter between Europeans, new migrants, and Indigenous Australians, from my perspective, is the key question of Australia itself. Okay? Historians, academics, sociologists, philosophers, politicians, they try to offer an answer, but not very successfully so far. Now, given what I've said to you so far, this is, if you like, a kind of historical circle through which the Greek community develops itself. In 1933, Grivas, the editor of Pan-Hellenic Herald, a very important Greek newspaper, would say this: to the Australian people, we are above all a foreign group. They care little about whether we have our citizenship papers. All they want from us is that we should behave as befits foreigners and guests, obey the law, and attend to our business. We need to take into account that the ideology of the foreigner that was to a great extent imposed upon ethnic communities like the Greeks, okay, was the decisive factor for the structuring of the public spaces within the communities. As I will suggest later on, this organization is a truly significant, to a certain extent the most significant, creation of Greeks as migrants, because it is the institution the foreigner creates to present themselves to the authorities as good guests. Okay? The ideology of the foreigner. That's basically what it was. Now, so in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, we have the ideology of the foreigner. Then we have a historical shift. 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s. We have the ideology of the migrant as citizen. And then, after the 1980s, those three pictures, we have the ideology of the successful community. We are now citizens, okay? And we are not just citizens, but collectively, we are successful. How do we explain this kind of circular movement from foreigner to citizen? More importantly, what is its significance in the development of Australian, modern Australian national identity? The question I asked at the very beginning. Remember? The diagram. Now, I'll start explaining in more details the diagram. But before I do that, personally, I get quite excited. But what about you? Is a break? Is it a break? Do you need a break? Or keep on going? No problem at all. So this is the issue here. Creation of white Australian national identity since federation from 1901 to 1973, the first stage, and the role of the communities of the perpetual foreigner within. In order to come to terms, if you like, with this historical landscape and the main principles that determine its identity or identities, in our work, we have introduced a number of philosophical terms. I won't discuss them, but just for you to get an idea. The hypothetical nation, the imperative of whiteness, ontopathology, the perpetual foreigner within, the being of the occupier, and collective criminal will. Perhaps at some other occasion we can discuss this. In another study of ours, which is written in Greek, we have developed the notion of what we call the perpetual foreigner within. And the perpetual foreigner within historically expresses themselves into those three, if you like, by those three models: the submissive foreigner, the subversive foreigner, the compliant foreigner, and the resisting foreigner. Those two books, together with the third one we are just completing, are part of a much bigger project. On the right-hand side, in those studies, we explore the main aspect of the so-called Western philosophical tradition. And on the left, we try to open up spaces to bring together this philosophical tradition with colonialism, especially decolonial thinkers from countries like Argentina or Mexico. Okay? But if we go back to this, the perpetual foreigner within, take into account that the first two models, those in red, the subversive foreigner and the compliant foreigner, were developed by the Australian state. Okay? So the Australian state, since federation, when they would look at foreigners like the Greeks, especially the Greeks, okay, they would see the compliant foreigner as an individual, you, the Greek, as an individual, could comply with the law, could be a law-abiding citizen. At the same time, though, and this is significant, they would see the subversive foreigner. And the subversive was always a group. So the subversive foreigner was a marker of a collective identity. The non-British, potentially, was subversive. That's basically what it was. Okay? So in the 1930s, they would look at us, the authorities, for example, the secret services, the Commonwealth Investigation Branch, before it became ASIO, okay? The newspapers, the official documents of governments, even the general public. They would look at the foreigner with suspicion as an element that can contaminate British purity. Okay? That was part of course, the ideology of colonialism. Okay? The last two models were developed by the Greeks themselves. The submissive foreigner was the model of the Greek who would accept their role as guests, as foreigners, but collectively they would present themselves to the authorities as beneficial. So they would say to the authorities, we are not subversive. Our cultural difference is good for you. Okay, guys? This ideology of the submissive foreigner, submissive with integrity, structured the way of thinking of the communities up until the end of the 1960s. Okay? The resisting foreigner is what challenges both the ideology of the subversive and the ideology of the submissive. And the resisting foreigner are forces developing within the Greek community that challenge authorities within the community and outside by saying, listen, we're not foreigners, first of all, we are citizens. Okay? And I'll try to explain where these guys came from and what they achieved. Now, take into account that the resisting foreigner, from the perspective of the state, is, by definition, subversive. You follow what I'm trying to say? Okay? And a subversive, of course, cannot become an Australian citizen, so they were refused Australian citizenship for many, many years. The subversive foreigner, the resisting foreigner, was the greatest enemy of the leaders of the community. Why? Because they knew that the authorities within the communities would identify those politically active, and they would say, they prove us right. You are subversive. So they were terrorized, basically, okay? So the communities were, if you like, suffering from terror. I'll try to explain this later on. This is a very significant factor in the development of the communities, which we have yet to recognize fully. So, here, again, we have the diagram. The Greeks are inside, outsiders. They are managed as foreigners. They are white, but not white enough. But in the 1930s and 40s, the emphasis is placed on the not white enough. Okay, guys? So we are insiders, and we semi-participate in this kind of community, or this kind of society, but at the same time, we are outsiders, because basically we are not British. Take into account that the true citizen during those times was the British. The non-British could never become a genuine, true citizen, could never truly love Australia. So, to the Australian people from Grivas, we are foreigners. And Grivas would also emphasize that we are also inferior. We have to accept it. They are superior, a superior civilization. Okay? So the Greeks here have a problem. On the one hand, they think of themselves as connected to ancient Greece. They would thought of their religion as the true version of Christianity. There is a straight line from the apostles to the Greek Orthodox. But at the same time, they would somehow internalize the gaze of the other, of the superior, and say to themselves, but we are also inferior. We can see that. This is a great civilization. We are not. Okay? What is interesting, what is very, very interesting here is the eye in the middle looks at the insider, not at the indigenous Australian. And when I say it looks, it literally makes the communities visible. The Greek community is absolutely visible to the Australian authorities, to the secret services. You would not believe when you read the files how much time the secret services spent spying on the Greeks. And they terrorized them, basically. Okay? Grivas, which was a very conservative man, wrote something very small about Cyprus and the English in Cyprus in the 1930s. And he was called in camera by the secret services. And he begged them. And he took out photographs from his family, his children, because they could close down his newspaper or make him suffer. This kind of attitude. Now, this image of the not white enough invokes the subject position of a perpetual foreigner in whom the possibility of subversion is inherent. Indeed, the subversive foreigner was also identified by virtue of an assumed predisposition for leftist political ideas and a lack of sympathy for British Australian society that was attributed to all non-British immigrants. Anglophone discourse of European immigrants, nationals, in particular those addressing the foreigners' potential to threaten national security, and Greeks fell into this category in the First War, not white, created a conceptual space in which it became possible to socially situate Greek-Australian migrants and their institutions as inside, white, outsiders, not white. Terrorizing, exposing, creating the subversive foreigner, not white enough. White British Australians, state, secret services, etc. 1916. Chris Fifis knows this history very, very well. 1916, destruction of Greek shops in Kalgoorlie and Balda. Why? Because the Australians thought that in the First War the Greeks aligned themselves with the Germans. That was a mistake. So what they did is they just went to, Perth and other cities and they destroyed Greek shops completely. Okay? 1924, government contacts a secret census of Greeks. 1924, alarm at influx of Southern Europeans quota. They reduced the quota all the time. 1925, severe criticism of Greeks in Queensland by Commissioner Ferry. They're not worth anything, according to the Commissioner, Greeks. 1928, bombs in the Acropolis Club, down here, next to Salachtites. Okay? Because they thought that some Greeks were strike breakers, or they worked. Christo, am I correct? Apergos pastas, thank you. Yeah. 1934, anti-foreigner riots in Kalgoorlie. There are a few examples of what was happening during that period. So in the guise of the subversive, the foreigner within could always be rendered fully visible to white Australian society. Full visibility enabled subjection to the control of the white Australian authorities. The Greek community leaders and the Greek press took up a foreigner subject position within the possibilities framed by the Anglophone discourses. Now, guys, this is extremely important for us to appreciate. A public space, a social space, is created by authorities, by the broader society in which we dwell. We don't create the space in which we dwell. Okay? This raises an important question. Which is the space in which today's Greek community dwells in? You follow what I'm saying? Who determines this space? What are the social expectations? How do we present ourselves? What kind of ideology do we cultivate? How do we connect with our history? Big questions for us. The discussion has yet to begin, in my opinion. Okay? Now, the Greek community and the ideology of the submissive foreigner. 1987, most significant date for Greeks in Melbourne, in Australia, okay? 3-4 years before Federation. This organization was the most authentic institution of Greeks as perpetual foreigners within, and as white, but not white enough, presenting themselves as submissive foreigners. Okay? So Greeks create this organization, of course, to fulfill their own particular needs, religion or Greek language, but all this are framed by the position of the subversive foreigner. Okay? So they create their organization, the public space, to create their identity, and present themselves not as subversive. Foreigners, submissive, they do what the authorities say, but they are useful, they are good people, they have good traditions. Okay? Cultural difference can be beneficial to white British Australian. This is the ideology of the submissive foreigner. The foreigner is the guest who present themselves as grateful and useful to the host. So they try to present themselves as civilized and as useful. What is hugely interesting, and those Greek Australians and other, even academics, who propose that the idea of multiculturalism, the benefit of difference, is somehow activated in the 1960s, in the 1970s, are wrong. This organization here in 1987 was a multicultural proposition, okay? Without, of course, questioning the authorities. A multicultural proposition in the sense that cultural difference can be beneficial to Britishness. But of course, this is what happens today. And it is this principle that was accepted by the Australian governments after 1973. You see? They accepted difference as beneficial, but of course, they created a different context, as I will try to explain. Now, this is... So, the pre-war Greek communities as disciplinary institutions, I'll explain that in a minute, of the perpetual foreigner as submissive subversive. Those who are constantly under surveillance develop their own mechanisms of self-surveillance. Now, this is hugely important, guys. The Greek communities are under surveillance by the authorities, okay? The institutions they create, the Greek community, the church, the press, are themselves mechanisms of self-surveillance. You follow what I'm trying to say? The institutions of the community try to discipline the members of the community to avoid possibilities of being characterized as subversive. Okay? So they will you would read in the papers, clean yourself. When you speak, don't move your hands constantly. They say those things, you see. They try to discipline the community, basically, okay? Don't speak Greek in public spaces. Dress well. You know, all those kind of different things. Now, so the community itself creates an identity through creating institutions. And these are the main institutions. Cafes. Why? Because Greeks are three categories in the 1940s or 30s. They are business owners of cafes, and some of them have made a lot of money. Okay? They are those Greeks who work of them, and then the majority of Greeks who are unemployed. Greeks could not work outside the Greek community in Melbourne. Okay? So there was great exploitation, basically, in the community. Okay? So there was a kind of class structure in the community. There were some Greeks controlling possibilities of employment. Okay? And the institutions were the cafes, the cafeni, of course. Most Greeks, especially the unemployed, would spend their life in the cafeni. Gambling was a huge problem. Alekos Doukas speaks about this constantly. Okay? Of course, the Greek consul, the Greek church, the Greek community here, and the Greek press. Okay? Now, if you look at those institutions, what is hugely interesting is the fact that they are divided. Look, some of them come from the outside. For example, the Greek consul. It directly relates to the fact that we are Greeks from Greece. The Greek church. It directly relates to the fact that we are Greek Orthodox. Okay? At the same time, the other institutions, the Greek community, the press, are local creations. They are creations of the Greek migrants as members of Australia. What was the significance of this? Well, because we thought of ourselves as foreigners, our, if you like, orientation, our being was hybrid, two-dimensional. We are locals, migrants here, and also we were represented by the Greek state and the Greek church. This is where lies the conflict between the Greek communities like this one here and the Greek church that divided the community for so many decades. The real question was, who represents the foreigner? The guys in this organization would say, we get together democratically as foreigners and represent themselves to the Australian state. The Greek church would say, no, you are a foreigner. Your point, the source of your legitimation is the Greek church, which is outside Australia. Okay? So this conflict goes on to a certain extent, even until today. But today, if we have time, I'll explain it later, those different political interpretations of the foreigner, the community, the Greek church, the Greek state, they are moving towards a very strong collaboration, not conflict. We are entering, or we have entered the post-conflict era today. Now, to give you an idea how afraid the community was and how strong the disciplinary mechanisms were, look at this picture. Those three guys created the Greek Atlas League, the left organization of Greek migrants in Sydney. Okay? This guy, Raftopoulos, from Mythaka, he was the first elected Greek union delegate. And his job was to organize the Greeks that worked in the Greek cafes. Because as I mentioned before, there was great exploitation. And he was quite successful. He made a number of members which voted for the left leadership of their union. Okay? The Greek leadership was terrified, okay? Was terrified that the working conditions were changing, and they were also terrified that the authorities would characterize those political activities within the Greek community as subversive. Okay? So they put so much pressure on this young man that basically he broke down and he committed suicide. He cut his throat. That's really what he was a kind of political martyr in the migrant movement for migrant rights. You see, but you can see that the leaders were terrorized, and they were terrorizing basically the community. I'm simplifying a little bit, but this is the big picture. Now, the discourse of the resisting foreigner. When do Greek migrants begin to resist, so to speak? Where does the idea of the migrant as a citizen and a committed citizen who challenges authorities, tries to change attitudes, where does it come from? It comes from the Communist Party of Australia. Okay? Okay? In order to fully understand our history, we need to appreciate the fundamental role the Communist Party of Australia has played, and also the Labour Party of Australia later on in the 1960s. Why the Communist Party of Australia? In the 1920s and 1930s, a number of Greeks, visionaries like these guys, became members. They were inspired by the Russian Revolution, by socialist ideas, and became members. And as members of an internationalist organization, First of all, they didn't experience racism. In the interviews, they all emphasized this kind of point. Secondly, they aligned themselves with other migrant groups. And thirdly, they felt Australians with an internationalist perspective from Greek origin. So the idea of the Australian with Greek origins begins in the political spaces of the Communist Party. It is these guys that, if you like, enter the community. Most of them have small business, so financially they are independent, and they create the Greek Workers' Democratus League in 1935. Okay? Now, the Democratus League in Melbourne, or the Atlas in Sydney, but Democratus is the first one in 1935, is the second, in our opinion, most significant institution that Greeks as migrants create. Why the second most significant? The first is this community. This is the second most significant. Why? Because it is the creation of the migrant that tries to transcend the position of the foreigner and present himself, herself, themselves as citizen. You follow what I'm trying to get? So here, immediately in the community, we have a tripartite division. We have the institution, this one here, of the local foreigner. We have the church and the council, which claim representation of the foreigner from the outside. Both accept the position of the foreigner, but who represents is the issue. And we have the third dimension, which is the institution of the citizen. Bringing the three together, imagine what happened in the Greek communities in the 1940s and 50s. You know, it was just, you know, they were killing each other, basically. Okay? Oops. Nico? You're a miracle man. Okay, guys, very quickly. In 1935, they create the Greek Workers' Democratus League, the first organization through which Greek migrants present themselves as citizens. Democratus, citizen, Greek Orthodox community, foreigner. The names themselves are not accidental. Democritus, Socrates, Plato, Atlas, they all come from the ancient Greek tradition. They're not Christian names. Where these organizations are Greek Orthodox communities. You follow the division? And this was a division in society itself, you know, I mean, Greece itself. The first Greek-Australian symbol, we have as I try to explain, this is the first Greek-Australian symbol. I'll explain why. The term Greek-Australian is introduced. We have the first feminist critique. We have People's Newspaper. We have idea of cooperatives amongst business people. We have club rooms for lectures and political discussions as public spaces for open discussion and critique. Now, if you look at this symbol, which is Democratus symbol, what you will notice is, of course, the name of the organization, the Greek flag, the torch of knowledge and wisdom, takes us back to ancient Greece. And in the middle, can you see those stars in the middle? Does anyone know what this symbolizes? The Southern Cross, thank you very much, which is a symbol of rebellion. Okay? So these guys in 1942, they tried to create their own symbol, the first Australian symbol. And according to Vasilis Stefanou, there was a division in the organization itself, because some members thought we are Greeks, we only want Greek symbols, and some other members said, no, we are Australians, and we have to create our own Greek-Australian symbols. As far as we know, this is the first and last Greek-Australian symbol, if you like. I'm not quite sure what it says. What this says about Greek-Australians, but this is the first and last attempt to create a Greek-Australian identity at this level. Now, take into account that in the 1940s, we have the Second War. That was a big event, I won't go into it. And then we have the civil war in Greece that divided the community. Okay? So take this into account. So a lot is happening and a lot of political intensity is created. So what we have here is something extremely significant. Redefining the public spaces of the Greek community as spaces for the democratic self-determination of Greek migrants. The end result of this process was the establishment of the Federation of Greek Organizations in 1941 as fully democratic forum for the governing of the community. Now, this is hugely important. Through very complex political processes, in 1948-49, about 17 organizations from all over Australia, including New Zealand, create a federated body as the representative of the community. Because the idea of, this kind of, let's name it, within the context of the Greek community, radical democracy prevails. Okay? So all the organizations need to participate in governing the community and in discussing the main issues of the community, not just the church or this organization. Okay? It was a magnificent, politically speaking, it was really a magnificent, historically very significant. In the spaces created, the collective spaces created, what is discussed is anti-foreigner feelings, racism becomes an issue openly for the first time. And they are condemned. The definition of the citizen is proposed. Cooperation between all ethnic groups, including British Australians, is proposed. Youth, women, new migrants are recognized as groups of special needs. Okay, guys? So, hugely significant. Oh my God. Can you be more generous, Nick? Hugely significant steps in the redefinition of how the community understood itself. What is also hugely important is that issues like the civil war in Greece or issues with Cyprus are presented not from a nationalistic perspective, but from the perspective of the concerned citizen. So Greeks, together with non-Greeks, who would protest in favor of Cyprus against England, this is hugely significant, or for issues in Greece, they would present themselves as concerned citizens, and they would present those political developments, events, as in terms of human rights. So you can see here slowly a new discourse appears in the historical spaces of modern Australia. What is also hugely important, and by the end of the 1940s, all four models of the foreigner are in operation. Within the Greek community, foreigners are members are subversive, compliant, submissive, and resisting, all at once. Okay? And as you can see here, we have competing interpretations of what it means to be a Greek migrant in Australia. In the 1950s, we have the mass migration, and we have new mobilizations. We have the unemployment mobilization, we have Bonegilla, we have the free naturalization and peace movement. We have the publication of the Greek-Australian Review. What is important is, in the Greek-Australian Review, Greek Australians for the first time recognize the indigenous problem as genocide. That was unheard of in Australia, a foreigner to speak about indigenous genocide. We have the publication of Neos Kosmos, another huge kind of event. We have the Committee for the Rights of Migrants, and we have the first groups of migrants organizing themselves in factories. Okay. In 1942, we have the Conference for the Rights of Migrants, which is repeated in 1963. Greeks, Yugoslavs, Jews, Lebanese, they get together and they develop the discourse of the citizen. And of course, in the 1960s, we have covered this. The community is divided. What you see there is a conservative newspaper, Pyrsos, and Greeks celebrating the Greek king and the junta. What you see there are Greeks demonstrating against the junta. But in the 1960s, what is distinctively important is that the left, the church, and the communities, they create pan-Australian networks. Because now they compete for, if you like, the character of the Greek communities in Australia at large. So we have the Labrakis network, we have the Greek Workers Network, we have Neos Kosmos, which circulates in the whole of Australia, and of course we have the church developing its power. And of course the church won. If you look at me from today's perspective, the winner, if you like, is the church. And I can explain why I think the winner is the church. Now, very quickly, Nick, very, very quickly. In 1973, Australia adopts the idea of multiculturalism, okay? So the Australian state adopts the principle of the model of the submissive foreigner, as I mentioned before. The Australian state adopts the principle that was formulated by this community and communities like this, that difference is useful, okay? In the era of multiculturalism, the Greek Australian is recognized by the state as compliant. That is, Greeks as individuals are not subversive. We are law-abiding, useful citizens, in other words. Okay. The otherness of the cultural difference has now been accepted as enriching the white Australian nation and as a matter of individual choice. Indigenous Australians are asked to participate in multiculturalism, this is a key factor here, by becoming like the ethnic communities, submissive if you like, that is, by accepting themselves as one group amongst many. Of course, Indigenous Australians resist. So the problem of national identity is perpetuated, okay? They resist. They don't want to submit. They don't want to become part of multicultural Australia. Now, more importantly, through multiculturalism, we move with Howard in the 1990s into the post-multicultural era. This era now is not a multicultural era. It is the post-multicultural era. And what is the main characteristic of the post-multicultural era? Anglo-Australians have elevated themselves to the managers of cultural difference and the guarantors and protectors of the unity of the country. What am I saying here? Well, with Whitlam, the government, the state accepts that cultural difference can cause injustices. With Fraser, the principle that cultural difference in itself is useful is accepted. With Hawke and Keating, the principle that Anglo-Australians are one ethnic group amongst many are also accepted, okay? But then we have a question. If everyone is different and everyone is a group, what about the unity of the state? What about the unity of Australia? Howard provides an answer, basically, by saying that the only group, which is one group amongst many, that has the historical knowledge and historical ability to keep things together is the Anglo-Saxon tradition in Australia. So the Anglo-Saxons become super citizens, okay? They control the state, they control bureaucracy, they control universities, etc., etc. Okay? This is the post-multicultural era, if you like, from our perspective. So, in this new Australia, if you like, okay, we have become insiders. The Muslims are insiders, outsiders. They are the subversive now, and we are the submissive, okay? In the white, not white enough, for us Greeks, the white is the important role, the important term. For the Muslims, it is the not white. So the Muslims today take the role of the Greeks had in the 30s and 40s, okay? But of course, what in this kind of experiment of creating a stable national identity, a coherent discourse, is that we cannot get rid of the main issue, which is indigenous sovereignty. Now, Greek migrants are no longer subversive today. They are respectable and present themselves in post-cultural Australia as a multicultural success story. Here we have a collaboration between the Greek Orthodox communities like this one, the Greek church, the Greek state, and the Australian state. That's where we are today, basically, okay? So, choosing our symbols in the 21st century. Nick, 3 more slides and that's it, okay? I'm posing a question, okay? I'm not providing an answer. Forgetting or remembering, this is the symbols we have chosen to present ourselves today, okay? Our traditions, language, economic success, love for Greece, Byzantium, ancient Greece, Greek nation, religion. What is missing here is what makes us what we are, migrants. None of our symbols talk about us. So it seems like the public spaces today are places of forgetting, not spaces of remembering. What is strange about this is that Greeks in Australia feel very comfortable with all these things. Feel very comfortable with, the return of the Parthenon marbles, okay? which is a very just, in my opinion, a very just demand, okay? But of course, it is an anti-colonial demand. We have to take this into account, okay, guys? It's an anti-colonial demand. We feel very comfortable celebrating our national day, an extremely important day, every year, but where we celebrate it, the botanical gardens, are sacred places. It's a long story, we can discuss it. And we can also feel very comfortable in Australia to talk about Macedonia, okay? But we never answer the big question. How can we talk about the return of the marbles and that Macedonia is Greek land? And it is. Perhaps it is, okay? And not fully appreciated that we are part of a huge problem, of a colonial gesture, historical gesture, that still continues, okay? And if you like, our proposal as a historians and as philosophers is, until we come to terms with this question, we cannot really fully appreciate our history as migrants. Today, the subversive groups occupy political spaces and make demands. We have stopped. We don't do it anymore, like Greeks. I'm finishing, Nick, okay? Love for all, hatred for none, proud Muslims, proud Australians, okay? Or Palestinians stand in solidarity with native people. Okay, guys? And now, Nick, the last one. I mean, almost the last one, okay? Sorry. I'm just trying to raise a couple of questions, guys. On the left, of course, we have this magnificent building with a symbol, the disc thrower. And on the right, we have the Shrine of Remembrance, okay? That's where we celebrate the 25th of March. In the middle, we have the diagram that I showed you before, okay? Now, if you concentrate on the Greek symbolism of this particular building, which is of debatable aesthetic value, okay, but that's something different, okay? Now, often Greek people, they go to places and they see those kind of symbolism, they feel proud. They look at the influence. But the truth of the matter is that those symbols are racist. We have to fully, not accept it, fully, if you like, debate it. Why racist? Because the Europeans, in their attempt to create a coherent discourse about the identity of the European in the 19th century, they chose symbols that would promote them as the continuators of the Greek heritage. Humans truly started thinking in ancient Greece. And the Europeans, basically the colonizers, 19th century Europe is a colonizing force, okay? They are the continuators of this great tradition. In other words, they are the true Greeks because they think, they've got technology, they've got mathematics, they've got democracy, they've got a legal system, okay? But Europe could not create a coherent discourse about this kind of historical development without the geographical Greece being Greece. That was one of the reasons that they liberated us, okay? But the Greeks, they were in the same geographical area with the ancient Greeks. They spoke the same language with the ancient Greeks, but they were semi-white, basically. They were Greek Orthodox Christians. They belonged to this great divide between the West and the East was barbarian. Okay? So the Europeans accepted the Greeks as continuators of the ancient Greeks, but basically they would tell them, become like us, because we are the true Greeks. Okay, guys? Now this, in my opinion, I'm just giving you a proposal, this comes from this kind of tradition. And we, using those symbols, we indicate that there is a geographical continuity, there is a linguistic continuity, but from this perspective, there is no spiritual continuity. Because it is Western Europe that produces the new Greek spirit that globalizes itself, etc., etc. Okay? And my very last, Nick, my very last, I really want to show this. If you go to Williamstown, just before you enter the main street, perhaps most of you have seen it, you'll see this very simple monument. Monument, in my opinion, full of integrity. On the 150th anniversary of the arrival of 191 girls on board of Lady Kenawai, a bluestone rock in Williamstown was dedicated to the memory to serve as a stone both of mourning and of welcome. The simple ceremony was opened by Victor Briggs of the Boonwurrung people in an acknowledgement that Irish and Aboriginal people have a shared history of oppression, and in regard that the Irish had also been party to the dispossession of Indigenous Australians. And this is what is written on this terrific monument, in my opinion. In memory of 1 million people who died in Ireland during the Great Hunger of 45-52. In praise of tens of thousands of dispossessed Irish who sailed to Hobson's Bay to build a new life. In sorrow for the dispossession of the Barangong and Wonomergon people, but in a spirit of reconciliation. In solidarity with all those who suffer hunger today. My hope is that one day the Greeks in Australia will build this kind of monument. Okay? Thank you very much.
Thank you, George. I'd let you go until midnight, but you're only Dr. Vasilakopoulos, not Commandante Vasilakopoulos. So anyway,
Sorry, Dave.
Okay. But we've run out of time, so I'll only take two questions because we've also got a few other presentations as well. Men and Strato.
I question that Greeks were white, but not white enough. I think Greeks weren't white at all in the 30s and the 40s.
Thank you very much.
And the example is my grandfather, who was here during that period, going for jobs, and the foreman would say whites only. That meant no Italians, no Greeks, no Jews.
Thank you very much. Point taken.
And that only changed after the Second World War, when workers were needed in the new industrial area.
Yes. Thank you very much. Yes.
Hi, George. You've presented an explanatory framework through which to understand the Greek experience here in Australia, but I'd like to know whether you've considered whether that framework extends beyond the Greek experience, and can it help us understand the experience of other migrants through the same period? Yeah. For instance, the Italians who we shared this history with.
No,
did they have the same experiences? Or did they form the same organizations? Did they react in the same ways or not?
Yeah, this is a great question. Listen, a fuller study would, if you like, engage with empirical material from other communities. But what I can say to you is that other colleagues have been using our notion of the perpetual foreigner or the notion of the subversive foreigner to make sense of their own ethnic communities. For example, Italians or communities from Latin America, or colleagues from a Muslim background. So, yeah. Okay. A more important question, I guess, is whether the notion of the perpetual foreigner within has broader significance for the European colonial project at large, not just in Australia. Okay. Thank you.